It remains for me, therefore, to hand over now to our chair today, Professor Martin Hall, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Salford, and himself a member of the Finch Committee. Martin.
Thanks very much, and welcome to everybody who came today. As Stephen said, I'm Vice-Chancellor of the University of Salford. I hope you all know where Salford is. I always have to ask that question in London. If you don't, you won't own up, I'm sure. The toilet situation sounds quite worrying, but I'm sure we shouldn't become anxious. But thank you for being here for this second day. As Stephen mentioned, it was my privilege to be a member of Janet Finch's group. I know Janet finds it quite disconcerting to have conferences that are organised around the concept of implementing herself. I'm not burdened with that, but it was a very interesting process being involved in the Finch group, and of course, as I'm sure Janet would have emphasised, our work in that was very much part of a process of transition rather than any attempt to find final results for extremely complex and challenging issues for scholarly publishing. One of the distinctive features of the work of the Finch group was the full participation of representatives of the publishing industry, which made it a milestone, I think, in these debates. And all of us who were there from, if you like, the academic side, really welcomed the opportunity to debate in depth these issues with our publishing colleagues over quite a long period of time. So it's very good that we're starting off this morning with a panel of representatives from both the publishers and indeed the sponsors of this conference, and I'm going to welcome them in a minute. How it's going to work is that we have a panel discussion now. We've got, as long as I stop very shortly, we've got 50 minutes for that. I've asked David, Philip and Ziad to, well, I haven't asked Ziad because he's only just arrived, but I'm now asking him from the lectern to limit their initial comments to around about 10 minutes each. Then I want to open it up to you to interact with them so that you can address to them particular issues that are stimulated from their initial presentations. That will take us through to a tea break, coffee break at 11:30. We'll then move to a very important part of the process, which is a perspective from the United States, because obviously, as we all know, a lot of the issues here is the concern as to whether or not the rest of the world is going to follow the direction that scholarly publishing is going in this country. We then move on to the perspective from the learned societies, and that really is, I think, the centre of gravity of today's discussion. As a member of the Finch group, I particularly welcome that. We were very fortunate in having Rita Gardner on the Finch group with us, and all of us on there were aware of the fact that the discussions that we were able to have in the Finch group on the role of learned societies in the future were notably incomplete. And this is an area of further discussion which I think is essential for the health of scholarly publishing in this country. So I think the contribution from these sorts of debates is critical to understanding where we move forward. And I really would emphasise that, and I know Janet would agree with me, there was nothing, as can be nothing definitive in what was proposed and recommended there. And then at 3 o'clock, we will have everybody back again for a 6-person panel discussion, at which point we will also have the usual and now customary process of hearing some questions that have come in via the Twitter feed. And for those of you who wish to tweet from your seats, the hashtag is #ACSSFinch, one word, ACSSFinch. And we'll bring some of those in at the session. And then we must finish promptly at 4 o'clock because a lot of people have got to get away, not least me, because if you don't know where Salford is, you need to know it's 2.5 hours away from here by train. And I'm anxious to get home at the end of the day. So that's what we're going to be doing through the course of the day. So let me introduce our 3 panellists. You have their names in the programme. David Green, Global Journal Publishing Director from Routledge, on my immediate right here. Philip Carpenter in the middle, Vice President and Managing Director for Social Sciences and Humanities from Wiley Blackwell. And Ziad Marar, Global Publishing Director from Sage on the far right-hand side. So without any further ado, let me hand over to David to talk to us. You're going to do it from here, David.
Good morning. The three publishers here, we have actually conferred about how we're going to do this, so that's not just raw advertising from each of us, because you wouldn't expect that. So I'm going to cover the general academic publishing industry position on OA and some problematic areas that we in the journal publishing industry do see in the current transition. Philip, I think, is going to cover some sort of practical implementation issues around that and, well, plenty of ideas anyway. And Ziad is going to, I think, focus in on the whole implications for social science and humanities. Okay. I've got an awful lot of notes that I'm speaking from, so I will no doubt get my 2-minute warning from Martin. In journal publishing, we're currently in a mixed economy world. There are remnants of the subscription economy that began in the 17th century and lasted into about the middle of the 1990s. The negotiated sales deals, library sales deals and online access world that began around the mid-90s, and we're moving into an increasingly open access model which actually started around around 2006 specifically. I think most of us have been involved in offering some open access offerings on what's called the hybrid gold model for a good time now. So we have a degree of experience around that. Journal publishers' main upstream customers have always been editors, editorial boards and learned societies. But our key downstream customers are inexorably changing from librarians and readers, or increasingly their readers are now called end users or downloaders, to authors and funders, which increasingly means also the involvement of ministries and government departments as well. And our discussions and lobbying indicate that a transition is certainly underway with 2020 as a target, certainly in the UK and Europe, for a transition to full gold open access, which is an author funder pays model. To be complete. The US is actually turning out not to be quite so keen on the gold model, and there are also voices in Europe who are much keener on a green model. In the UK, we are awaiting a formal HEFCE announcement, although I gather that there were some HEFCE pronouncements made yesterday about the mandates that will surround its QR funding on publicly funded research articles. HEFCE, it seems, won't have any extra money for the universities to pay for that, and it's likely that QR funds are going to be counted as publicly funded research, and that the APC payments for Gold OA will have to come from existing QR funding. We were told by RC UK that the universities and the vice-chancellors and principals may not like this, but we have to move to a Gold OA world. This fills us as journal publishers with a certain amount of dismay, as that didn't seem to be in the spirit of Finch, which did indicate that there would be a fully funded transition to a sensible article funding model. Most journal publishers have signed up to the STM, the Scientific Technical Medical Publishers Statement, which is a trade body, which is that publishers support sustainable open access, and we certainly wish to see that. The key elements are sustainable, fully funded open access business models and free author choice of publication venue. The journal publishing industry trade bodies represent quite a diverse community of both for-profit and not-for-profit organisations, and it also includes many small learned societies who are perhaps self-publishers or who have got contracts with the commercial publishers. We certainly believe as part of this that one size does not fit all subjects and titles, and even within the harder sciences and medical sector, it's often considered as one homogeneous area, but there are quite distinctive differences between disciplines, and I'm thinking particularly of areas like maths, which actually operates in terms of the life cycle of articles and citations much more like a social science. And interestingly, there was a major American study, I don't know how many of you have seen this, the National Humanities Alliance study in 2009 of 8 large US learned societies, which they paid for themselves, and they found that a gold OA model for social science and humanities with their journals was not financially viable. If you want that, it's NHALLIANCE.org, and you will find all the details of a very thorough report, which said that it cost an average of, they costed 9,994 was the average cost, direct cost of producing an article in one of their 8 journals, as compared with an average of only about 2,670 for comparable STM journal articles. Some of the reasons for that is the average humanities and social science article is about 19 pages long. In STM, the average length is about 12 pages long. Acceptance rates also vary dramatically on average between humanities and social science and STM. Only 11% of submissions on average are accepted in humanities and social sciences, compared to 42% in STM subjects. If you get to areas like physics, it's almost 90% acceptance rates, because it's a big science and everybody knows each other, and you wouldn't be a decent physicist if you didn't have access to a lot of big kit that's very expensive. So gold OA with APCs at RCUK decree level could be sustainable in some subject areas and for certain journals, particularly the new fully open access online startups that we are all contemplating and busy launching. And gold has generally been welcomed. It's certainly seen as a panacea for certain subject areas. However, the Research Councils UK have confirmed to us that some society journals, which are dependent on mainly on UK-sourced papers, could see their income halve under a full transition to a gold open access route. Their stated aim is to put pressure on the market and get academics to publish in journals that have cheaper APCs, to try to drive the price of the APC down. Another side effect is that we are moving to a gold OA model and recommending that to learned societies. There is a lot of kickback from American learned societies who do not wish to introduce a gold option. They're happy to forego UK publicly funded papers. For example, the Association of American Geographers have indicated that they're not prepared to offer a gold hybrid option. So that will no longer be a potential publication venue for UK-funded papers. They also are concerned about potential impact on learned societies. Our meeting at RCUK said that, yes, should perhaps they look at a transition fund for learned societies. This was one idea being mooted. I don't know how far that'll get. But certainly there is a recommendation that some of the learned societies do look to move to other revenue streams apart from the profit shares and royalties they get from their learned journal publishing. Some of the other issues we have, embargoes. Social science subjects do have very different usage and citation profiles. There is a very interesting French study on half-lives of French social science papers that is on the ALPS website, and they found that a study that only 18% of that actual year's content was accessed in libraries, meaning that 82% of usage was actually to stuff that was older than 1 year. Even 3 years may be not enough. For example, in literature and linguistics, 39.5% of the usage was to papers that had published, it was only published in the last 3 years, meaning that more than 60% of accesses was to material that was published more than 3 years ago in French literature and linguistics journals. And of course, there's the ALPS survey of librarians, which indicated that if there were very short embargoes in particularly arts and humanities, there was likely to be more cancellations of that if librarians could get that material very quickly on open access. There needs to be a collaborative cooperation between publishers, funders, and other stakeholders which are sensitive to the real differences between disciplines. This is the way forward, and we publishers are completely open to this and would like to participate. Both the Finch Report itself and David Willits, in his response, actually recognised the potentiality for some of these problems. I'm not sure they looked at all the unintended potential side effects, But Wellcome and RC UK policies as they stand at the moment and their mandates seem to drive right through some of these recommendations. And researchers and authors really should add their voices to these discussions too. And it's interesting to see that historians particularly seem to be mobilising, tweeting, blogging, and trying to organise themselves around issues of embargoes. I've got some stuff here about green OK. Green open access can work, but it is symbiotic with a full subscription publishing model. It is nice to see that open access does not mean it, and I think Finch did recognise this quite clearly, that open access does not mean it is free of all costs, that there are costs involved, and we as publishers are very grateful that was recognised within the Finch Report. And this indeed is being picked up in the EU discussions. I was at an EU roundtable in Brussels a few months ago, and members of that committee talking about open access were absolutely clear, yes, we absolutely understand that open access is not a free option. So there is that. There are funding issues around that. As I say, it looks like we're moving to 100% gold funding by 2020. There are still, I think, issues of discoverability, article push, social media marketing. Just going onto the internet and posting material is not enough, and functionality of platforms. So when the APC is given as a figure of 1727 plus VAT, we're not entirely sure in the publishing industry exactly what is being counted in to that figure. There is certainly quite a lot of confusion around that, but the message we've got clearly from the RC UK is that anything that is publicly funded, by 2020, there should be gold money available. Okay. So if you look at the decision tree there, that's about, this is on the Publishers Association website. It has been run past Ron Eggington at BIS. It's been run through certain people at RC UK and through Wellcome, and they did confirm that this decision tree is accurate. So if there isn't an APC money, but there is gold open access available, possibly available within a journal, but the money does not get paid with an APC, then Green OA will be there respecting publishers' embargoes. And that is slightly in dispute at the moment within RC UK, but that is the position as outlined in the Finch Report and the Minister's response, that decision tree. But there is some controversy around that, and I think the Publishers Association next week is going to release a backup statement about our understanding. So there are actually two green open access routes that emerge from Finch and from the Minister's response, which is often not recognised. There are enough copies of this at the back for people to look at. My final point is probably around the mandates for a CC BY licence. We are concerned with the CC BY licence, particularly in social science, arts and humanities. It only covers rights out. This is often not recognised. It does not cover rights in to the originating publisher from the author. Most academic publishers do not these days seek to take copyright away from authors, but we're quite happy to receive a licence and it's left with authors. But the point about CC BY is it does mean a real loss of author control over their reuse of their work down the track. Poor translations, appearing in anthologies that may be unacceptable. A reuse further down the chain might not be by reputable academic authors or publishers, and such pirate operations may feel no obligation to adhere to industry's code of ethics. And you're relying on people down the chain to respect the right to attribution. Now, that is the only author right that's basically left. I think someone tweeted me yesterday that someone had said that moral rights are retained under CC BY licence. Our lawyers don't actually see that. We can't see that at all. The CC licence cover authors' paternity rights by making it a contractual attribution, but that is absolutely all that it is. The author hasn't asserted it in a copyright declaration. There's no such thing as copyright anymore. Therefore, it's not a moral right. So there is no author moral right left. At the same time, authors need to be very careful about third-party material in a CC BY licence. Potential damages are going to be huge because it's not just sitting on one publisher's platform, it's potentially all the way out there being mashed up, being reused, etc. A legal review has shown the need for much more prescriptive author and publisher disclaimers on reuse of each article published on a CC BY licence, as well as increasing the meticulous attention to permissions for such material as photographic material, video, music or art content. Seeking permissions will be much harder as well in a lot of arts and humanities subjects. It's hard enough getting some people to clear permissions on pieces of music or pieces of video, or indeed Bill Gates and his virtual monopoly on virtual art. Loss of publisher protection. We will no longer be able to defend authors under a CC BY licence as publishers. So, just to sum up, author choice, we don't much like CC BY. We are going to offer that as an author option in order that we, you can comply with me, as I say. The CC BY mandate potentially lead to loss of further income streams, particularly for learned societies. There is more coming down the track. The Global Research Council, about over 100 global funders, will be meeting in Berlin in May. People like the Max Planck Digital Library in Germany, a very powerful organisation, are saying things like there should no longer be a version of record. There's simply an ever-evolving article that people contribute to. They don't much like the idea of one original author article and many digital copies. They want to free all that up. They don't like the impact factor and traditional methods of measuring quality or proxies for quality. They want a lot more altmetrics. There are some very loud voices in Europe with some of these ideas. So our main thing is that we believe that authors need to have clear access to information, clear understanding of the issues. We as publishers will try to participate in that, but authors particularly need to make their voices heard in this debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. There was a lot there, and I'd encourage you to come back to David with more on the points that particularly interested you a little bit later on. A world without a version of record would be very interesting, wouldn't it, from the scholarly point of view? Interesting for the social sciences, but very, very interesting for fields like epidemiology and others which depend on the quality of the data. I'd just like to comment that I would agree that that decision tree is correct, from my understanding from Finch. But the only point that I'd add, David, is that Finch had a view on embargo periods, but the 6-month embargo period is actually the RC UK position, which came on top of Finch. And obviously, there's a lot of debate in here about what appropriate embargo is for publicly funded money. The reason they came up with 6 months is the principle of the availability of publicly funded research. But that, just to make clear, is their position, subsequent to Finch. So with that, if I could then pass on to Philip to make his presentation.
Thank you very much and good morning. I have 10 minutes to answer two very big questions. Question number one, what might the future look like? Question number two, what should we all do about it? So to answer these questions, I'm going to propose just two possible scenarios of how the future might work out. And I'm going to then outline three basic, broad strategies that we, in various ways as publishers in this room, might respond. So the first question then is about how will OA play out in the future? The Finch Report, as we were hearing yesterday, has a clear view about an orderly transition towards gold. And if you talk to RC UK, it's quite clear that they have a very clear, indeed stark view about forcing the UK to go gold, and they're going to take the rest of Europe with them in the process. But the truth is that none of us actually know what's going to happen, and we can't predict. However, I would suggest that the key variable in determining the future is around how much money there is in the system. So, I'd suggest we look at two possible scenarios, one in which the amount that's spent on journals is pretty much the same as now, maybe a bit more. The other in which the amount spent on journals, the amount spent to get access to content, becomes much less, becomes much cheaper. So, here we go. So, following Finch, my first version of the future is called the mixed economy. So, in this version of the future, gold open access, green open access, the subscription economy all coexist. So, you might see, for example, the UK goes gold, Europe goes gold too. The US, however, which is after all the biggest producer of research papers, may decide to go down the green route, and maybe the US will say that embargo periods need to be long enough to support the subscription economy. What about China? Well, China is currently the second biggest producer of research papers on the planet, may soon become the first. It may be that China will sit the whole thing out and say, well, why should we give away the fruits of our R&D investment to the capitalist world for nothing? We simply don't know what they're going to decide. So you might get some variation by geography, you might get some variation by subject area. So biomedicine, life sciences, very keen to support open access for good reasons. Other disciplines, notably, say, chemistry or the humanities, actually have quite a lot of suspicion around open access. So it may be that the future is determined somewhat by disciplinary community preferences. So, as this all works out, you could find that we've got a stable, complex, mixed economy. And in that mixed economy, it's even possible that there may be a bit more money in the system than there is now if governments decide to fund gold while the subscription economy still continues to exist much as before. So in this kind of rather rosy version of the future, what's going to happen? Well, I would suggest that the biggest brands in inverted commas, do best. So the strongest journals are going to be able to attract more of the best papers. They're probably going to be able to charge a bit more than the weaker journals. And conversely, some of the weaker journals may find that their sources of papers are drying up somewhat, and they can't charge so much in the form of APCs to publish them. But generally, I think either for the stronger or the weaker, there's going to be less money available for every article that's published. And there are two reasons for that. Reason one is that APCs are generally going to be lower than the amount of revenue a journal is receiving per paper published under the current system. Reason number two is that some subscriptions must surely be cancelled the more mandates there are out there. So, that's one version of the future. Here's a second version of the future. I've dubbed this one the low-cost economy. And this is less rosy from a publisher's perspective. So in this view of the future, the price of a gold article goes down over time. It's driven down either through competition between publishers or because those who hold the purse strings, HEFGE, RCUK, whoever, decide that they want to drive APCs down, and indeed that is RCUK's stated goal. And at the same time, the funders may require embargo periods that are so short that librarians say, well, actually, we may as well just wait for a paper to become freely available. We won't bother with our subscriptions anymore. And subscriptions therefore crash. And David, a moment ago, referenced the ALPSP study, just to spell that out, asked if they would continue to subscribe to arts, humanities, social science journals on a 6-month embargo if the majority of papers were free. 25% of librarians said they would cancel all their subscriptions in those areas. 2/3 of librarians said they would cancel some or all. So, in this scenario, a lot of money is driven out of the system, but this scenario is not necessarily terrible for everyone. The mega journals, of which PLOS One, I guess, is the archetype, those journals that have a large throughput of papers and low operating costs would probably do fine in this version of the future. And I think the bigger brands, again, may do relatively better. They could attract more papers. They could charge relatively more to publish them. So those are my two versions of the future. We can discuss how realistic they are, how inevitable they are later on, perhaps. So I just want to say how publishers might respond to those hypothetical futures. I don't want to suggest that these strategies are appropriate for everyone in this room, for every journal, for every society, for every publisher. And, I guess my colleagues here may not agree with what I'm going to say. I probably have wily colleagues in the room who won't agree with what I'm going to say. But with those caveats, here are a few suggestions. So, in the mixed economy, my rosier version of the future, journals or societies may decide they want to publish more. So they may want to add gold papers incrementally to their portfolio as part of a hybrid mix. And they may also decide there are opportunities for them to start gold-only titles. And they may decide particularly to take that route if they're in the position that they're currently rejecting very large volumes of papers. It's not atypical for a social science humanities journal to be rejecting 9 out of every 10 papers submitted. So they may think that actually they can publish more without unduly sacrificing quality. They may also decide they want to internationalize their author base. 2 reasons, really. One may be good, one may be bad. One would be to maximize their share of the best papers from around the world. But they may also say they need to do it as a hedge against open access policies in different geographies. At the same time, they may say that they want to capitalize on the repute of their journal or on the resources of their subject community, their membership base, to provide other publications that their field will value. They might be things called books, magazines, reference materials, learning resources, access to others' open content, and so on and so forth. So those are 3 strategies under the broad heading of broadening their program. I think those strategies also work in the negative view of the future. So in a low-cost economy, more throughput compensates for lower prices. A wider author base is still a hedge against mandates, and new sources of revenue can compensate for declining journal revenues. So that's strategy 1. This is strategy 2. Forgive me if I make a kind of motherhood and apple pie statement, but in any version of the future, success is going to depend on understanding the needs of your community, providing what your stakeholders want, and particularly demonstrating that you're providing what your stakeholders want. So, what do they want? I've listed some stakeholders and some things that they want. This is not an exclusive list, but authors, for example, they want their work to be read. They also want their work to have an impact. And they want their publisher to be able to demonstrate that, not just in terms of citations, but in terms of impact via social media and so on. What about readers? So readers in the future are going to value ease of discovery. That becomes an issue in an open access world. They're going to value linking to related papers, to source data, to reference databases, and so on. And it's this functionality that they're going to find on the publisher's site, or indeed on the society's site, which they're not going to get from the raw version of a paper deposited in an institutional repository. And it's the publisher's investment or the society's investment in taxonomic coding, semantic enrichment, which is going to enable that discoverability, linking, interoperability, and so on. What do funders want? Well, reasonably, they want a return on their investment. They want evidence that the editorial process is robust and supports research integrity. They want their papers that they fund to be published in journals that have impact, that have influence, and they want evidence that societies and publishers are supporting the whole community, in particular younger researchers. What do members want? Well, seems to me members of societies want support in all aspects of their professional lives, in their research, their teaching, their professional practice. They may increasingly look to their society to support them in their continuing learning and maybe to provide accreditation to them. So, in short, understanding what the community needs is the key, first of all, to preserving the value of the journal the society publishes, but secondly, I think it's also the key to unlocking other opportunities for new activities and new revenue sources. I have one last slide before the chairman tells me I've run over. So in all of this, we have to recognise that in both scenarios, the mixed economy and the low-cost economy, I've said that revenue per paper published will almost certainly reduce. So even if the volume of papers goes up, the cost per article needs to reduce. In the mixed economy, impact may not be very great. In the low-cost economy, it could be quite severe, quite drastic. So how would you respond to that? Well, in most fields, and I realise I'm walking a bit on ice here, in most fields, it makes sense to minimise the investment in the old technology, which is print, and to maximise the investment in the new technology, which is digital, because digital can do so much more. I mean, paper journals can't embed multimedia, they can't have Chinese user interfaces, etc., etc. You see the point. Another way of reducing costs is by sharing costs. So societies may decide that the best thing for them to do is to partner with other societies. They may decide the best thing to do is to partner with publishers, because publishers actually have the expertise, the efficiencies to provide the economies of scale that are going to be required. And I just make the point here that publishing in the future is going to become more expensive rather than less expensive, because we're going to have to maintain two ecosystems side by side. We're going to have to maintain the old subscription models side by side with the systems and technologies required to support open access. I have one final thought, which is less a strategy than a kind of call to action, and this follows on very much from what David was saying a moment ago. I don't think any of us in this room, I hope none of us in this room, would want to be unwittingly responsible for destroying journals that are valued by their communities, and I hope we wouldn't wish to be responsible for destroying societies that are valued by their communities. So we need to assert two things. We need to assert that journals in the humanities and social science are more expensive to run than in STM, and that means we should argue for APCs which are higher in SSH than in STM. Secondly, we need to point out, as David has done, that journals in our sector are more vulnerable to cancellation by librarians because the half-life of articles is so much greater. And I think that means we must lobby for embargo periods which recognise that fact. The point being, as has already been said this morning, that gold funding may not be sufficient to support publishing in the HSS sector, and without the subscription economy, the green alternative simply can't exist. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you for bringing that back so directly to the interests and issues around learned societies that will feed very much into the discussion today. So finally, before we come back to you to ask questions of the panel, Siak.
I don't have slides, or shall I just take this off so people aren't distracted? Let's put that. These are yours. Okay. Hi. My role is really to try and expand a bit on the question of the relevance of the OA debate for the social sciences in particular. all this talk of the future and mixed economies and gradual change puts me in mind of that line from the cyberpunk novelist William Gibson, who said, "The future has arrived, it's just unevenly distributed." And I think that's extremely apposite in this context. When we look at the scholarly communications debate, I think we need to step back a bit for a second and just look at the nature of the beast as it currently is constructed and where social science fits within that. So just to start off with a few facts and figures about the scale of the scholarly communications industry when we focus on journal publishing in particular. There are something like 3 million articles submitted per year to something close to 30,000 peer-reviewed journals. About 1.5 million of those articles end up being published somewhere. They're published by something like 2,000 publishers. And those publishers range enormously from big commercial enterprises, independent publishers, large or small, university presses, learner societies. Janet Finch has referenced yesterday to learner societies as though they're distinct from publishers. I think slightly misconstrues it. They are publishers, in fact, publish a lot of the prestige and elite journals that the scholarly community is dependent on. And obviously that's deeply relevant to today's agenda and to people in this room. So the machinery of scholarly communications is of that kind of a scale. I don't know how much peer reviewing that is to get those 3 million down to 1.5, but you can imagine a lot of interactions happening across disciplines, across regions on a kind of global scale. So where does social science fit into that? Well, roughly, of the 1.5 million articles that are published each year, and by the way, that output is growing by about 3% a year, around 10% are in HSS. A little over 10% are in HSS. Look at it through a different lens. If you think about the government money dispersed through the research councils last year, which was in the region of £2 billion, again, a little over 10% went to HSS. I think that those are very important contextual factoids to have in mind when we think about the nature of the OA debate and scholarly communications. HSS is a very small tail on a very big dog, and wags it much as it likes. I'm not sure it'll make the impact, to use that much debated word, that it would like to have. It's incredibly important and valuable to see a gathering like this to try and tilt that balance back. And I think a lot of people in social science are particularly concerned about the fact that this debate is being swept along by the STEM disciplines, understandably, where OA has been well established and well embedded for a long, long time. There are very successful companies, Biomed Central, Hindawi, have been around for many, many years, publishing very successful open access journals. It's not controversial in biomedicine and life sciences to have an author-pays model being the dominant one. In social science, it's a very, very different story, and I think a lot of people are concerned about the lack of a natural read-across. I think the issue around that, the problem of that read-across, is further exacerbated by the fact that social sciences aren't one thing. If you look at the LSE typology, you'll see the range of disciplines with a chunk that sort of abut the STEM disciplines and often define themselves in those terms, where psychology might be an example. Another end of the spectrum where they abut more the humanities, where they're drawing on philosophy and history and so on, and then a lot of what they call core social science in the middle. So social science itself doesn't even necessarily converge on its own self-identity in such a way as to say what makes it different from STEM. So that's a very important thing for us, I think, to have in mind, because I think the nature of the open access debate has been very much about knowledge consumption, about unfettered access to information, as though that information is sitting there and needs to get into the hands of those who need it. But what it has obscured from view somewhat, I think, is a true understanding of the conditions under which that knowledge is produced in the first place, and that isn't one phenomenon. Knowledge production varies depending on the kind of knowledge it is. And I think, in a way, that's a profoundly social science question in and of itself, and be one that I think people in this room could engage with. Now, I was very encouraged, actually, to have the reminder from Janet Finch yesterday when she said, part of the aim of what the no longer referred to as Finch Report is about is really trying to achieve three things, not just access, but access along with sustainability and along with excellence. And I suppose that's where a lot of the concerns eventually converge, because sustainability and excellence in the social sciences have particular kinds of characteristics. So we as a social science publisher have been trying to engage with this one way or another in the last few years. We launched Sage Open, which is the kind of attempt to be a sort of a mega journal solution for the social sciences in a way that PLOS One has provided for the natural sciences. And in that process, trying to do a bit of learning by doing. But the other mode of engagement we've been involved in, and I want to sort of briefly report back on here, is surveying the vast range of academics, editors, learner societies on whose behalf we publish, to try and sort of pull some of those diverse voices together and get some understanding of what it is that are the predominant concerns in the social sciences. And that includes sort of detailed sort of focus group research where we've been sitting down with specific societies. And in fact, one of those contributors is in this room. We'll be hearing from Felisa Lavigne soon, and we were having meetings in DC, including with ARA and APS and ASA and various things, because it's not just a UK phenomenon, as people have emphasised. So what have we learned from that? Well, yes, there are some people who are kind of relieved and excited that there is an open access movement underway. But I would say that they represent a very, very small minority of the feedback we've had. Again, to quote Janet Finch again yesterday, she was saying that she has learned that it's a broad church with a few evangelical wings. I think it's true to say that broadly the evangelical wings are mainly STEM voices. And I think that it's a more sort of more cautious welcome that's arriving from the social sciences. Broadly, what we've heard, while there's been a small number of people expressing excitement, broadly we've heard two responses. Confusion, on the one hand, and concern on the other. And I'll come to the concern in a bit. The confusion is striking because I think it reflects the fact that this has been a STEM-led conversation. There was one little data point. The American Political Science Association have a major handbook they published 2 or 3 years ago on academic publishing, and they devoted a total of 2 pages out of 250 to open access. The conversation hasn't really penetrated into the social science disciplines in anything like a convincing way. It's really striking just how much people needed very basic explanation about the difference between green and gold, very basic explanation about the fact that it's not just vanity publishing, it's actually well established in the STEM disciplines and so on. But it was striking just how far the gap was in terms of immersion and knowledge. And actually things are moving on so fast, it may make little difference actually to even see that begin to change with the mainstreaming, as it were, of OA since the Finch Report. But under the heading of concern, there was a blizzard of different kinds of issues that were raised, which I think we could try and sort of cluster under 4 broad headings. One about funding, one about sustainability, one about neutrality, and the last one about authority. Broadly, I mean, that's just clustering them. So the funding one is obviously the major and underpinning one, and obviously I've referenced the fact that the disproportionate funding that goes to different areas very much tied up and bound up with the idea of how the social sciences are valued generally and what does it mean that they are funded to the degree they are. We heard yesterday that there were that the NIH dispersed $29 billion of funding, to give you a sense of just where the scales of money tend to go in the scholarly system. I think even this year, there's been that move by Governor, now Senator Jeff Flake, to try and defund political science from the National Science Foundation entirely. So there's just an issue about just how the social sciences are funded de facto, and the fact that actually the way learner societies exist and thrive is based on the journal business. That's actually what they have. There aren't really many other sources. And then if you look at it from another angle, we did a case study of one of our society journals, a social science journal, which in 800 papers it had received, only about 12% of those had any notional or identifiable funding at all. So the funding issue is radically different. On the question of sustainability, I think there we can pick up the topics that we've heard already about, half-lives and so on. Social science works by being a dynamic stock of knowledge, as the LSE puts it, and they've got this 3-year impact review that they're doing at the moment. This dynamic stock of knowledge relies on journals and relies on articles having been established and validated over time and potentially being re-engaged with over time. I was talking to one academic who was saying, Yes, we're still mulling over what the true consequences of Ken Gergen's article, Social Psychology as History, published in a journal in 1972. The matter isn't yet settled. I think it's a really important way of looking at it to understand that sustainability, therefore, depends on journals surviving over time. Happily, even rather specialist or critical journals that are that are out now tend to survive, because once they've picked up enough of a subscription base, they tend to survive. Will that be the case for those minority journals in the future? So that was one of the concerns raised as well. And the third concern around neutrality was really to do with the fact that in STEM, people are used to the fact that the funders are one of their interlocutors, that actually they have to figure out how to make the knowledge claims in that context. That's not been the case so much with social science. There's been a heavy reliance on a concept of academic freedom. Now we're going to see the university step in as sort of key local funders, making their own choices about, well, is there a quantitative researcher deciding whether qualitative research is good enough to desire, worth getting its bit of its budget? And even if the OU was working on that demand-led budget, as I think we were hearing, that could very quickly switch into, we've got to choose, and that's a tough choice. So it starts to change the dynamic of the relationship between the social scientist and the university. And then on the fourth point about authority, just a lot of concerns about the nature of how knowledge claims are built within the social sciences, about the extent to which prestige brands and journals are a crucial part of that the learned societies are a crucial part of that, and that even when it comes back to that point about vanity publishing, the idea of author pays may skew the actual selection base in an area where social sciences don't have such sort of rapid and solid convergence as you do in physics. Yes, 90% get published in physics, because physicists all agree that force equals mass times acceleration. Get 4 sociologists to tell you what power means, get 7 definitions. So it's a very different set of preoccupations about the nature of authority which need to be borne in mind. So I will finish off then by just saying that this conversation has moved along so fast, it's accelerated so fast that the social scientists will have a potentially limited impact. However, it's incredibly important to see this forum and this venue start reverse that tide. I think the Academy is to be congratulated in actually trying to convene across a range of learner societies, a range of potentially siloed discussions, and to recognise the complexity of the issues. As, again, Janet Finch said, it's a complex ecosystem we're talking about here. And so a Harvard mandate saying you have to publish in open access doesn't necessarily mean that they'll hire people who publish in open access. So we need to be clear that we don't set up skewed incentive systems which ultimately undermine 2 of her 3 pillars. Think about sustainability, think about excellence, and what does that mean for social science? Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few minutes now then for questions. If you could keep them sharp and short and say who you are and who you're directing it to, and I can see one down at the back there, blue. Stephen's sprinting around with Mike.
Thank you. My name's Stella Butler. I'm University Librarian at the University of Leeds. And I'd just like to make a few comments and perhaps ask a question of the publishers. I'm extremely disappointed that in a panel of publishers, and I think it's fantastic that we have got publishers here alongside academics, but I'm extremely disappointed that not one of you has addressed the situation that was identified by Finch of double dipping. I think just to defend librarians, because comments yesterday about certain of the attitudes of librarians, none of us want to cancel subscriptions. Indeed, RL UK, the Research Libraries UK, is making representation and has done to RC UK about the danger of subscriptions and the restriction on access to content, non-UK content. We want to maintain that for our academics, but we are in a situation where we will not have enough money for all the APCs, for all the articles with the number of articles that will be published. We need to have some reassurance about how the process of transition will be managed, and particularly transparency. I will finish. Transparency over double dipping and over how there will be reduction in subscriptions to marry the increase in income through APCs.
Thank you. Let's hold that question for the panel and take another one. I'm going to take about 3 together, and I've got one over here.
It's worth saying that we will be back later as well. Just for
you
those
will.
who are finger open.
You will indeed be back later.
Aware. Yep.
Are we here? And then
Yes, Alistair Fitt, Pro-Vice Chancellor Research at Oxford Brookes. It was a question about sustainability, and I wanted to know if any of the publishers had business models in the future that countenance the fact that universities might not provide all the refereeing and writing and editing free in the future.
Thank you. And I had one over here.
Thanks. I'm Terrell Carver from the Political Studies Association and the International Political Science Association. I have two quick questions. One is, Dame Janet told us yesterday that there is in the research publishing ecosystem a moment of crisis. She said the internet had changed everything and that the way things are is no longer sustainable, and that it was evidently up to UK government, one ministry, RC UK and HEFKI, to sort this out for the world for the next 15 years. So I wonder if you could just quickly say whether or not there's a crisis as you perceive it. And the other question is, I'd like to ask you why you are not lobbying with the private enterprise angle. Last I heard you were profit-making private enterprises. The economic thinking here seems to be that taxpayers pay for research, which is questionable, and they want it free. Well, actually, as a taxpayer, I'm not interested in 99% of this free or at any price. I'd rather you guys took research that arises in the UK, exploited it through a worldwide market, and I believe most of your sales and money come from outside the UK. And so far as I know, you actually create employment here, at least in Oxfordshire, and pay business rates, and I presume you pay some company tax, though I haven't checked.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. You might have described the... Ziad might have described the social sciences as a 10% tail, but clearly it's a vicious 10% tail. So what I'm going to do, because we're going to come back to some of these points later on, I'm now going to go to each of the panelists in turn and ask them to address those questions that they wish to address in whichever way they do, and just to make a final closing comment, because I don't want to keep you from coffee in 2.5 minutes' time. So, David, shall we start with you?
Okay, very quickly. I mean, we can all elaborate on this. Double dipping. So far, for Taylor and Francis, because we don't have a lot of hard medicine, we've not actually had that many open access articles published. And every year we do look, and I would say it's some of the behavioural science or therapy journals, social work type stuff, where there is a health component that has had, I would say, maximum of 2 or 3 OA articles a year. When you actually look at it, it's sort of less than 1%. So we have moderated any price rise on those journals. There is a real issue, though, with double dipping. I mean, RC UK have come to us, as I'm sure they've come to my fellow publishers, and said that if 20% of a journal's content comes from the UK and is made open access and APCs are paid on it, then they would want that to come off subscription prices for the UK university libraries. Well, that's fine in theory, but a US library, because 20% of it was being paid for by UK APCs, they would say, actually, we've got this stuff on open access now. We are not prepared to pay APCs, but we want 20% off the price because it's now on open access. So you can see that spiral, that it's not just the UK. We're in a global market. Around 10% of our publishing is UK sourced. And I think because of Routledge and Arts and Humanities, we're typically higher than some of the others that have got very hard medical programs. That's double dipping. On sustainability, I came into journal publishing in 1978. I actually ran peer review systems, and we used to pay referees. Those journals are now with Elsevier. Elsevier did stop paying them because the editorial boards voted to stop paying referees. I go to board meetings, I go to less and less as I have to deal with politicians, accountants and lawyers a lot more in my somewhat elevated position, so I don't actually get to talk to many academics. They don't let me out to play very often anymore. But we say at editorial, all the publishers, editorial directors here will say, do you want to start paying referees? We can factor that in. We can budget for it. Almost entirely, editorial boards say, apart from medics, funnily enough, no, and some lawyers, no, we don't want to pay referees. It would distort the process. It's a community service. I'm quite happy to pay referees. We can all factor that into a business model. Crisis in transition, the private enterprise argument. We've been told the private enterprise argument won't work, that we've been told by government. Go and talk to some of David Cameron's special advisors. The private enterprise argument won't work for the content and media industries. It seems to work for people like Google and Microsoft who seem to hover around there. I won't go any further on that one. But
Thank you. Thank you very much. Philip.
I'm in danger of repeating everything that David said, and so keeping you from your coffee. But I suppose from the Wiley point of view, we, I think, are happy to accept and indeed support the principle that if a journal article has been paid for through an APC to be made freely available, then it is not, in our opinion, reasonable then to charge for it again. So you can't charge twice for something. However, this double-dipping argument is a bit vexed because there are two versions of it. There's double-dipping at the journal level, and there's double-dipping at the institutional level, or indeed the country level. I don't know if I need to elaborate on that, but we have the argument on the one hand that you can't charge twice for articles in a journal. Then you have the argument that if an institution is contributing a lot of APC money, they should get something back on their subscription budget. Those two positions run diametrically opposite each other, and that's a very tough position to reconcile. Refereeing, I agree with David. I think there are very mixed views about this in the academic community. Crisis, well, I wouldn't say there's a crisis, but I do think that all of us in this room need to articulate a position loudly and clearly, because if we don't, then we will have a crisis.
Thank you, Philip. Ziad?
Well, I'll minimise repetition. On double dipping, we have a stated policy that we will offset, and we've already talked to people where we're doing those deals. What I would reiterate, though, that given that most of our publishing is social science, there isn't a huge amount of APCs in our Sage Choice option as it is anyway, and we're playing around with the actual price for APCs. In fact, for Sage Open, it's about $1,000 less than PLOS One, and it's still actually hard for people to find the money. So I think that repeats the general point about where social science fits in with this. But the principle is we won't double dip, we will offset. And on the sort of sustainability and editorial services model, I think it goes into a broader conversation, which I'm sure there isn't time enough for, but what is sort of commercial sustainability and appropriate levels of profitability and the nature of journals publishing? And all I'll just say is it's not one homogenous lump. Look at it across the range. A lot of the major actors in it are learner societies, who are a lot of the journals that we publish on behalf of are learner societies who get almost all of their income. Most of it actually goes from the library to the learner society. And then there's a whole range of journals where we're actually launching them. There actually virtually is no sustainable model to launch a journal. Now, some people are saying, don't bother, there are too many journals already. Other people are saying, don't stop people publishing, as we were hearing yesterday from Hefke. I think we have to think about, actually, how knowledge production happens, and actually launching journals has been one of the important mechanisms for disciplining. And unless you've got actually a reasonable way of actually making them viable over time, they're not all hyper-profitable is the point. So we need to just look at the nature of journal publishing as a rather heterogeneous thing. And is there a crisis? There's obviously huge disruption and huge, but in a sense, it's also potentially exciting. It's actually been it's interesting times, whether you see that as the terms of the Chinese curse, or whether you actually see that as a genuine sort of attempt to sort of reconfigure and think properly again about the scholarly production, scholarly communication system. We're not running around with our hair on fire. We're actually trying to engage with it, trying to learn by doing, but it's quite possible there are versions of it where there could be damaging unintended consequences that flow. For example, unfettered green with no embargoes, especially in social science.
Thank you. Ziad, Philip and David will be back in this afternoon's panel, as you will be back promptly at 10 to the hour, so that we can... Oh, we've been allowed an extra 5 minutes for coffee. Thank you very much. You will please be back by 5:02 so that we can resume the next session. Thank you very much indeed.